Okay, welcome back from the break to our very last session where we will continue to dive into the remaining GeoField use cases. And we have 3 more presentations lined up. They'll take us across continents and across different types of interventions. So we will be in Nepal looking at sugarcane, in Bangladesh looking at stress-tolerant rice, and then in Ethiopia looking at sweet potatoes. So our first presentation will be with Dinee Tamang and Kumar Singh. And Dinee is a resilience monitoring, evaluation, learning, and reporting advisor at Mercy Corps. And as you know, Kumar is a senior geospatial scientist at AidData. Again, with previous sessions, we will hold questions until the end.
Okay, thank you very much. Hello, buonasera, and namaste. Greetings to you all. I'm very excited to be here, able to share with you all on the work on our GeoField use case. In this presentation, we bring you a GeoField use case from Nepal, titled Reducing Environmental Risks Through Sugarcane in Nepal. I am Dinee Tamang, working in Mercy Corps as a regional mall advisor for MRED program, also called Managing Risks Through Economic Development Program. I am supported by Kumar Singh, who technically led this work from AidData, and later, if there are more technical questions, he will be supporting me as well. This presentation brings information from the article published on the geospatial impact evaluation of a low-cost agricultural intervention for enhancing environmental resilience, with other authors that I have to name: Pratap, Rachel, Ryan, Chet, Brad, and Ariel. Okay, I have them written down notes, so I'll be turning the page and following through. So I present you the problem first. Why, what is the situation, what is the context? So before we start with the details of the GeoField use case, I would like to share the background of this work and why we started to do this work. So today, we present you experience of GIE using MRED as a case study in Nepal. We bring you this study, which focuses specifically on Kailali and Kanchanpur districts, which are prone to seasonal floods, especially during the monsoon season, and heavy rainfall leads to river overflow and inundation of low-lying rivers. On the screen, you are looking at the map of Macheli Mohana watershed in the far western part of Nepal, displaying flood hazard maps. There are several rivers that are flowing from Chure Hills in the north to the southern plains. These rivers meander and sift riverbanks every year, and with every monsoon, floods cause inundation and riverbank cutting. With increased extreme rainfalls, recently in July 2024, Kanchanpur recorded the highest rainfall in 78 years. The Department of Hydrology and Meteorology, rain gauge station at Dodhara Chandani, recorded the highest rainfall in Nepal at 624 millimeter in 24 hours. So what's the solution? Managing risks through economic development, or MRED program, is designed to support disaster-ready communities by reducing their vulnerability to climate shocks. It has operated in targeted low-attention disaster-prone regions across 3 countries in Asia, Indonesia, Nepal, and Timor-Leste. Since 2013, through 4 iterations, MRED 1 to 4, and is currently running on 5th phase, partnering with around 230,000 underserved and underrepresented people from 218 communities across the 3 countries. The case highlights promotion of sugarcane cultivation as a nexus along the barren riverbanks, together with the conventional DRR practice, like bioengineering, providing dual benefit of being able to withstand impact of flooding, as well as providing some income opportunity incentivizing community members to maintain the DRR measures and retain the DRR capacitated, trained community members for disaster preparedness and response. So that was the solution. And what we were observing, MRID had conducted multiple household survey-based quasi-experimental studies where there was no disaster, and also impact evaluation where there was disaster, and proven that MRID households fared better than non-MRID communities, highlighting improved social, economical, and food security outcomes. But we also saw around 518 hectares of land being protected, the increased greenery and vegetations, as well as, and all of this was not being captured by the household surveys. Thus, we wanted other ideas that captured those benefits. Thus, GIE was introduced as a pilot study in MRID program. Then the team set out to explore, did sugarcane reduce environmental risks? And that is reduce soil erosion, reclaimed flood-loss lands. To do so, the program wanted, the team, they started to try to understand how MRID was being implemented. And as we prepared to work into GIE, one of the key things was looking into where these interventions were being held. So the team could understand if there was a pattern to selection of communities MRID was working on. And yes, MRID was not implemented randomly. Communities were selected closer to riverbanks that were being impacted by floods, and which had initially large riverbanks, which were barren and inundated by floods, so that sugarcane could be planted in those areas. Now, so what were the data sets that we were working with? So initially, as we were trying to do this, as explained earlier, as the process was about like finding whether our organization is ready or not, similar kind of work was done with MRID as well. What kind of data sets do we actually have? We want to do a geospatial evaluation, impact evaluation. So do we have geospatial data? So first, the team looked into what data already existed, looking into data from MRID program itself, like the recent flood hazard map that I showed earlier, mobile-based sugarcane mapping data of some of the locations, specifically related to one of the sugar mills. There are two sugar mills actually operating there, but we had data from one of the sugar mills only, which we had collaborated with. Another, it was the location of the MRID communities themselves. Second, the team explored other data sets beyond MRID program, both open source as well as commercial data sets. Some data sets that were ready-made available, we used them, and some they needed to be generated. So how did we do this? As this is GIE, we started first with satellite imagery. The project has leveraged both open source and private high-resolution imagery, Copernicus Sentinel-2 10-meter resolution, and PlanetScope satellite imagery 3 to 5 meters resolution, alongside machine learning algorithms. It also used the sugarcane mapping data from the field and locations of MRID communities. These data sets were used to train and develop soil erosion maps, sugarcane mapping through the use of Google Earth Engine for the program areas. Further, other features were manually digitized retrospectively for multiple years, as shown in slides, to identify necessary features, as program did not have all of those required features geotagged or digitized. MRID program was initially phased across 63 communities in Tarai region. However, the team focused on 53 communities where the intervention zones directly intersected with the riverbanks, as this was critical for measuring erosion-related outcomes. Preparing for GIE, the data was compiled, aggregated, and analyzed at community level. By combining the data with causal inference techniques such as optimal full matching, a method for creating statistically similar comparison groups, and difference and difference, which estimates changes over time between treated and untreated areas. The team could rigorously estimate change in sugarcane cultivation and landscape conditions across more than 50 communities in Nepal's Terai region. Now we move to the challenges or limitations. Due to lack of samples, the study compared between different communities similar to emerald communities using optimal full matching method using remotely sensed variables as proxies for estimating propensity scores. The difference in difference was then used to identify the changes over time between emerald and non-emerald communities. The study does highlight that due to retrospective nature of the data development, the quality of images and skills of the team members played an important role in data quality. As I remember us going back to the model and data one more time when we were working on this and preliminary results were not on par. I'm actually finishing. So this is the last slide actually. The study concluded that there was spillover effects seen for the sugarcane cultivation into the non-emerald communities, but also it could not show any significant environmental change when compared using the map data of soil erosion. Now, what does this mean for us, right? For us, the lesson learned was, it was not a complete win, definitely, but not a loss as well, as this pilot study highlighted that a retrospective data collection and study also can support the GIE, but a better context-informed and better prepared program for the GIE would be able to showcase probably better impacts that are not yet possible with household-level surveys alone. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dinee. We'll now move to our second presentation with Matt Hallas and Jeff Michler. And Matt Hallas is a geospatial practice area manager at Dev Global, and Jeff Michler is an associate professor in the Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics at the University of Arizona.
Thank you. Right. So Matt and I are going to be talking about a use case that builds on a study that was already very heavy in its geospatial data. So unlike a lot of these other ones where the initial kind of study didn't involve a lot of GIS work, this one, the initial study was almost exclusively GIS work, and we tried to then build on that, and Matt will talk about what his group did different than ours. So what this is a project initially funded by Karen McCurs and SPIA. We're looking at submergence-tolerant rice varieties. So a variety of rice that was developed 20 years ago now by Erie. It's a variety of rice that can sustain flooding much longer than a normal rice cultivar. This image here shows you a field trial at the Erie location in Los Baños. You can see very substantial differences between rice growth across these varieties when they're flooded. This stuff, as I said, has been around for 20 years. It's been studied by agronomists. It's strong evidence that it works. Kyle Emmerich as part of his dissertation, ran a RCT to look at this in Bihar, found strong impacts. The variety was introduced into Bangladesh in 2010, so it's been around, publicly released for 16 years. And what SPIA wanted to know was, we know this thing works, and we know it's been in the country for a while. What's the spread of it? Can we do an impact evaluation at scale where we look at who's adopted this, where it's been adopted, and what its effect is at a national level? It's a great idea. Problem is, it's been introduced 16 years ago. Who has data pre-2010? No one did a baseline of this, so we have no credible pre-adoption data. Additionally, it's a stochastic technology. It creates this Goldilocks problem. Too little flooding, as you can see on this graph here. The black line is normal rice. The blue line is the sub-1 variety. Too little flooding, 5 days or less, you're not going to be able to see a difference between the sub-1 and the non-sub-1 varieties. Too much flooding, more than 15 days, you're not going to see a difference either. They're all going to die. And so we need to find the Goldilocks sweet spot where we have flooding between that 5 and 15-day window. Like Ariel said, you don't go out hoping for a disaster, but we need something to show up just in that window if we're going to identify an effect. This paper's already been published. It's part of the JDE special issue that Ariel and Karen and others edited. What we did was we decided to use Earth observation data where we lacked household data, which isn't a particular, is no sort of innovation there. Again, we only have household data after 4 years after the introduction of this variety. Even using EO data to try and get at this where we lack household data, we run into several problems. One is we lacked ground truth data. No one was going out and collecting data on the plot locations, things like that. Additionally, there's this recency bias in EO data. Sentinel, yes, it's been up there for 10 years, but sub-1 varieties have been around for 16 years. So we can't use Sentinel to go back and look at what the ground looked like pre-2010. So what we did in 2020 when we first started this project was innovative at that time. We took the Sentinel data that we had that goes back to like 2015, and then we took MODIS data at a much coarser resolution that goes back, several decades. And we developed a convolutional neural network long short-term memory model where we trained the model on the Sentinel data as ground truth data. So that was our ground truth. We developed a relationship between the MODIS data and the Sentinel data, and then used the model to predict the past, to look back 10, 15, 20 years ago and see, well, if Sentinel had existed then, we can downscale the MODIS and see what would it have looked like back in the past. If we were doing this now, we'd use vision transformers. So like I say here, recent methods, but already, just within the last 5 years, these methods are out of date. So what we find significant impact, but only at a very specific point in the distribution. And so let me explain these two figures. The first one's a specification chart. You're not supposed to be able to read the labels on either of these. They're visuals to look at the patterns. So, right, we need flooding at a certain window. What that window is can be anywhere between 5 and 15 days. So is the window 10 days? Is the window 12 days? Is the window starting at day 7 and going through day 7 for 7 days? The window is there, but it could vary based on place and time and crop or location. Additionally, how much flooding do we need for it to be submerged? We don't know. And so there can be a number of different ways to measure the kind of extent of flooding. The agronomists aren't any help in narrowing this down. And so what we do is we run thousands of iterations of a difference in difference regression over 20 years of geospatial data and try and see, well, kind of agnostically, do we see a sweet spot? Can we identify a place, the right amount of flooding for the right amount of time that shows a significant impact? And we do see that kind of over on the far right. And it's basically flooding at the 45th percentile of the 20-year floods and at, about 10 days of flooding. So I like to show this figure because a lot of my research is on research ethics. Since we don't have strong priors about what the right window is, I could have run these thousands of regressions and only shown you those that are significant. But we run thousands and thousands of regressions, I show you all of them, and then you can decide whether this is a real effect or whether this is just, you get lucky some of the time, you run enough regressions, you'll find some results. On the paper, we have numerous iterations of this, and the window always shows up at the same place. Why are there so many places that it doesn't work? One of the things that we've learned is these stochastic technologies are incredibly sensitive to mismeasurement. And so this other graph here is a graph of p-values. I took Kyle's RCT data that's well measured, well identified, and what I did was we injected noise into the data at iterative steps to see, he finds significant results. How much measurement error could we have where we'd suddenly find no results anymore? And so each of these are the distribution of p-values. The very top one is the results from Kyle's paper, significant p-values. What we then do is inject noise at 1% of the standard deviation of the data, run 10,000 iterations, 10,000 bootstraps basically, or Monte Carlos, and then see what the results are. And basically, at 2% of a standard deviation of the data, all results go away. Right? This is incredibly sensitive. Even if we had survey data going back 10 plus years, there's no way people would remember at the end of the season how much flooding occurred, to what extent, for how many days. This is a highly sensitive technology. It's really hard to find a meaningful effect. And using these GIS tools gives us sort of the precision that we would need, even if we had the original data, or even if we had household data. I will say one of the things we did here, this is all at the district level. We don't have data on what actual field adopted. We don't have data on, which farmer adopted and which farmer didn't. And so you can think of this as, in the US, we do this a lot. We do county level studies about yields and things like that. And so this is effectively a county level study. We're looking at we're inferring adoption based on the change in the GIS, in the NDVI signal, and we're doing it at the county level. So it's a very coarse estimate of what adoption would be. We don't know how many people there are. We just have a sense of the percentage of a district that is likely under STRV cultivation. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Matt. Oh, actually, no, I told him I'd go one more slide. Sorry. All right. We did collect ground truth data over the 2 years that we were doing the study. We collected in 2021 and 2022. We used this as part of our training data set. When Ariel approached us about doing this as a use case, what we decided we'd like to do with this is try and step down in resolution, right? My study is done at the district level. Can we use this individual ground truth data and try and do this at a plot level? Obviously, we can't go back to 2010. We're looking at hundreds of meters of resolution in that data. Rice fields in Bangladesh are incredibly small. And so the goal with this use case was to try and say, can we use these methods to predict adoption and impact on yields at the farmer field level?
Alrighty. So precisely, basically high-level objective for the use case in the GeoField context was trying to map the adoption of submersion-tolerant rice with time series Earth observation data. So we'll get into kind of how that turned out. So to begin, talking about kind of the methods and the data for trying to map these flood-prone areas. Who doesn't love a good data and processing chart, as we see here? So it's a multi-sensor stack utilizing MODIS data to an NDVI and EVI to assess vegetation conditions, Sentinel-1 data for the actual flood mapping, and then SRTM data to help with slope extraction. So we basically, the work involved using a spectral matching technique, image classification with these ground surveys as mentioned, and then kind of integrating that with a few of the other derivative data sets that we mentioned. So really basically kind of the top level question is, can we separate sub-1 rice? Sub-1 rice is the submergent tolerant rice variety that we were talking about. So can we separate that from other rice only using satellite data, right? So that's like the hyper-specific GeoField use case here, is if we kind of didn't have the previous work that was done, if we kind of wanted to go in after the fact, how far can we get, how accurate can we get solely using EO data sets? So it was, in our use case, Sentinel-1 SAR data from June to September to see the flooding and standing water through clouds. Then Sentinel-2 optical was basically utilized for the post-flood vegetation recovery. So the effort was to use a random forest classifier trained on the 88 available ground survey rice points. And of the 88 rice-specific data points that we had, 13 of those were confirmed to be sub-1. So the interesting thing, I would say the quick high-level result is that rice versus non-rice identified very reliably. So that's a great thing. That's, I think what many of us would have expected with a random forest classifier. But the important fact of what we were trying to prove out is that there wasn't a confident and replicable ability to differentiate between sub-1 versus the other rice. And as you'll see later, actually, each of the sub-1 plots that we had was actually classified as other rice. So what it comes down to is, I think a lot of us are kind of coming back to regularly here is how was the initial data that would later be used as training data in an Earth observation model, like how was that data collected, and was it done with the thought that an Earth observation sort of modeling technique would be applied? In this case, that was not the case. There was not kind of this thinking of, oh, there's going to be a random forest classifier that they'll run in 10 years, so we'll be sure to have the attributes that are delineated just for that. Obviously not the case. So what I do want to make clear, though, is that this is really more so a training data problem, less so a sensor problem. So this just shows spatial distribution of the submergence in 2021. As Jeff stated, there's obviously kind of this peak Goldilocks time frame that we're trying to hone in on. So these are monthly composites, and they actually, as we all know, Sentinel-1 is pretty high quality, and it very effectively maps the flood extent over time. The peak submergence basically also was able to be mapped quite well. And our hope was that the analysis, thank you, can target variety distribution campaigns and household surveys. I only have 5 minutes. We're gonna flip through things a little quick here, folks. So the ground truth data that we had, as mentioned before, it was not necessarily initially collected with this end use case in mind of a EO-focused impact assessment. And really what that resulted in, like I said, was from 2021, the data that we had, there were basically in total 248 rice plots. Of those, only 13 were the sub-1 variety of interest for the use case. You'll see also basically in 2022, we had 833 rice plots. 96 of those were sub-1, which shows with the household survey information, we had a roughly 11% adoption. And so our effort here is to say, okay, based on the survey data that we know, if 11% adoption is what it is, then can we actually predict that using this random forest classifier? How close to the 11% are we going to get? So these are some of the initial outputs that we have. So we have an EVI-based sub-1 classification as well as an NDVI. I'm going to just quickly run through these, even though I love a good map, just to show the final table. It'll be a little bit easier. So what we can see here, y'all, is we wanted to not only identify with the random forest classifier how accurately could we detect the adoption, but compare it against, two different derivative data sets that were at the core of the random forest. And we show that, there is difference between NDVI and EVI. One of the bigger differences that we saw is in the estimation of fallow lands, which for many of us will kind of recognize that NDVI will oftentimes overestimate what that is because of basically like soil moisture that gets misclassified as potentially fallow. So the model output indicated that of the areas studied, 1.16% with EVI indicated sub-1 adoption and planting. NDVI was 0.88%. And of course, that is, incorrect, shall we say, and not consistent with the actual survey data that we have. So what worked and what didn't? Again, what I would say is, as we know, SAR or Sentinel-1 is great, really good at mapping the submergence. We ended up preferring, shall we say, EVI. Let me see. One of the main problems that we encountered goes back to how you go about setting up an impact assessment for Earth observation data, and what are the attributes captured in the initial training set. So one of the issues was that basically the stress-tolerant rice variety data that we had that was used as training data did not initially disaggregate what was the sub-1 variety versus other types of stress tolerance. So obviously there's salinity tolerance, drought tolerance, all these other ones, and they all just kind of got grouped together and referred to as stress tolerant. And of course, we are trying to specifically identify the submergent tolerance. So it's an issue more, I would say, of the survey design, not sort of with the foresight of the future random forest model work that we would do. Let me quickly see. I want to make sure we get through. Several minutes? Okay. Cool. So I'm going to go back. So what I basically just reiterating what I said, right? That historical survey data, it's not going to be perfect. You're not going to be able to take survey data designed for one very specific purpose and just immediately map it to everything that you want to do from an EO perspective. So there's limitations on that. I would say that we also encountered issues where we thought to ourselves, okay, there should be available additional ground truth points that we should be able to get from some potential partners like the Asian Development Bank. And those were not actually available in time to us to be able to essentially add to our sample size or our training set size, for the random forest. So, another quick lesson learned, right, is like think about those backup plans earlier in terms of if one data source may not be as reliable or may not be as robust, try and think ahead as much as one can about how could we fill that potential gap. I would say a big thing is this team planning before the actual design and ground survey. So have a consortium, have a collaborative group of people that are EO analysts, agronomists, economists, enumerators, impact assessment specialists, and the stakeholders themselves, the funders, policymakers, et cetera, and utilize that group to have a again, collaborative and kind of team think discussion on, okay, if we design the survey this way, does it answer all the potential future questions for the EO stakeholders, and of course, vice versa for the agronomist, for the economist, et cetera. So when we look ahead and we think about Earth observation for impact, this study, as Jeff mentioned, was kicked off several years ago, and a whole lot's changed. New sensors are available, new computing methodologies are available, massive new derived data sets are available and getting improved upon and expanded upon. So one sensor that would have been really exciting to utilize that's just recently launched and finally getting good data is NISAR. So that's the NASA-ISRO joint launch that happened last year, and they're just now sort of getting data that's calibrated and ready to use. That in the agriculture context could be really, really valuable because of the L-band aspect of it. And L-band, without getting too deep into it, is essentially really effective at penetrating vegetation canopy. So if there are basically also studies that need to focus on where there's cover crops, then L-band will be really effective at that. There are new derivative data sets, as mentioned, better DEMs, there's commercial SAR. One organization I'm excited about, Earth Daily, is launching their very hyper-focused like ag constellation that's going to be, I believe, 7 or 8 satellites, probably a meter or two. They haven't released the spatial res, but they do have 22 spectral bands that map to both Landsat and Sentinel spectral bands. Let me see. I know I gotta wrap up here. All right, so one last thing that I promise I'll end shortly, is that we really want to communicate the importance of Earth observation as infrastructure. And I'm a GIS person and have been for a long time, and it's often a afterthought at the government level, or it's a nice to have at the government level. And not only should it not be that at the government level, both on the funder and the policymaker level, it's like there should be this consideration that if we're making investments in a region, maybe we should plan ahead on mapping exactly how effective it is, what the adoption, what the spread is, et cetera. So it needs to be considered in the study design in the early investment phases. And I think that the funders out there are definitely starting to kind of turn the page here, but there should be really a strong consideration of any sort of investment with agriculture having a geospatial component to that. Lots of other follow-up and finishing thoughts here, so if you guys want to catch me or Jeff after, please feel free. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jeff and Matt. We will now turn to our last presentation of the day, and this will be by Katherine, Nolan, and Ariel BenYishay. Katherine is a research scientist at AidData, and of course, Ariel is the chief economist at AidData.
Okay, hi everyone. It's great to be here today to present to you our Erie, Ethiopia project. This is a retrospective evaluation of the International Potato Center, also known as SIP, their emergency seed aid project that occurred in Ethiopia from 2021 to 2023. I'm presenting on behalf of 2 of our co-authors, Angie Zhu and Seth Goodman, that are both at AidData as well. And I'm gonna go through some project details, some results from our survey, and then hand it over to Ariel to talk about the remote sensing results. So, as I said, this was an emergency seed aid project. It was funded by BHA, RIP, and it was through the ERIE Consortium, which stood for Expanding the Reach of Impact Evaluations. It was focused on how do we do retrospective evaluations specifically for humanitarian projects that often are not designed to have a rigorous impact evaluation. So this was supposed to be a short-term project. They go in, they provide short-term agriculture training, some nutrition training, as well as OFS, orange plus sweet potato planting materials, and improved potato planting materials. It was not designed to have a long-term impact, but BHA approached us to do a study to see if people were still using the seeds, if this short-term project made a long-term impact. We had 5 different research questions. We're only going to focus on the first 2, which was impacts on production. Did this increase farmers' production of potato and sweet potato? And impacts on farming practices. Did it change, improve the farmers' practices related to these crops? So as I mentioned, this program is not designed to have a comparison or control group originally. So when they came to us, we had to think creatively. And this project was rolled out in administrative boundaries areas, so the worredas. They only treated specific worredas throughout these districts. And so what we did was we took households on either side of the worreda boundary that were treated on one side, 5 kilometers, and then on the other side, 5 kilometers that were not treated. So we used these administrative boundaries to do a regression discontinuity design. So the data collection happened in 180 combeles. We did about 3,300 total surveys, split fairly evenly across comparison and treatment households. There was also a qualitative piece to this survey implemented by our partners at Mathematica, but that was mainly focused on health outcomes and gender outcomes. But they did focus group discussions and key informant interviews that really helped contextualize our findings. So the results, we find pretty widespread impact of the orange flush sweet potatoes. We see, in the comparison group, only 3.5% of households reported planting any OFSP in 2023, and 2.4% reported planting the specific varieties provided by SIP. The SIP program then increased this by 17 percentage points in the treatment areas, so a pretty big impact. We also see impact on their knowledge of OFSP, as well as kind of an overall index that we compiled, which has knowledge, practice, and attitude scores when it comes to OFSP. So you can see here, this is 2023, planted any OFSP, either Belg or Mare seasons, the two different seasons in Ethiopia. 0 is our boundary, and then the right is our treatment, and then you can see the left. So you can see a pretty good discontinuity here. This kind of may speak to the fact that OFSP households, treatment households had greater knowledge of it and liked this product and continued to plant it. We also took a look at the subgroup who planted it and wanted to see kind of, are there any differences between households? And we find that households with metal roofs were slightly more likely to plant it. We don't find a huge difference in households that were part of any sort of agriculture group. However, we do see in the communal resource group for some reason that they were more likely to plant. But we also notably on this slide see that female-headed households were also actually less likely to plant the OFSP, which is somewhat surprising because sweet potato is often seen as a women's crop across several countries in sub-Saharan Africa. We also took a look at irrigation. We want to know, did irrigation, having access to irrigation impact whether or not you planted it? We do see in the Belg season, if you have irrigation, you're more likely to plant OFSP. And then we see a little bit the reverse in the Meher season, but it's not statistically distinguishable. This is probably due to the fact that the Belg season has more variability in its rainfall. So having access to irrigation is a better, a surer thing if you want to plant a new crop. We did look at, I mentioned potato in the beginning and then didn't talk about it all, but we did look at improved potato. We see a much greater saturation of potato in the comparison and treatment areas. So we don't see a huge impact from the potato intervention. We find that the comparison group was growing, 63% of them are already growing potato, which, as I mentioned, 3.5% were growing OFSP. So it was kind of already in the area. We do see some impact on the potato knowledge and the overall index that we constructed. This could be due to a number of reasons. As I mentioned, the people already grew it. It's also harder to track a colorless potato. When the potato's bright orange, it's pretty easy to remember and report back on it. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Ariel.
Thanks, Kathy. This will be my last time talking today. Tomorrow, I promise I will shut up. I should also say I'm presenting work that was largely carried out by Seth Goodman and several of our other team members who are the actual experts on deep learning models like this, so apologies in advance if I mischaracterize any of the effort. But in many ways, like some of the work that you just saw in Bangladesh, we wanted to see how much farther we could push the results by adding Earth observation to the recently collected survey data to try to understand whether we could improve precision on certain dimensions and to what degree this would replicate. We also initially tried to do this in a way that would capture spillover effects to other households who are not in our survey sample. More on that in a few minutes. So there's a lot of recent work trying to classify crop types. This is, obviously very, very useful. There is very, very little work trying to classify sweet potatoes specifically, especially in a sub-Saharan African context. Again, this would be very, very useful, but it's challenging for many reasons. I should say for most of this remote sensing talk, we're going to focus on sweet potato writ large, which includes white flesh sweet potatoes, not just orange flesh sweet potatoes. The SIP project focused primarily on orange flesh sweet potatoes, and many of the impacts you saw were on specifically OFSP, but we were trying to detect above ground characteristics of a crop rather than the color of the below ground crop. Okay. Those efforts in remote sensing that have focused on sweet potatoes have really looked at other dimensions rather than kind of the classification, presence versus non-presence. You can see there's lots of interesting work, especially some using drones and UAVs to do this. Again, very little of this happening in sub-Saharan Africa in a context like Ethiopia's emergency situation. So our workflow essentially was to combine the survey data that Kathy showed you, again, sampled primarily along the boundaries of waredas in which one wareda was treated and the nearby bordering wareda was not, and to use the farm level plots as effectively training data over which we overlaid satellite imagery and feed that effectively through a deep learning algorithm that would attempt to distinguish between the presence of sweet potato and other alternative crops. We have about 3,000 plots, Kathy mentioned. Each plot, the enumerator was to go to collect essentially 3 separate GPS coordinates roughly in the center of the plot, through which we could combine to create a buffer area, not of the full field perimeter, but at least of a large enough portion of the field that we would have confidence in the crop type and general perimeter. We wrestled with all sorts of alternatives for collecting this ground data. We've already had lots of questions about how do you effectively do this in context. We're happy to chat about why we ended up doing this afterwards. That is, ask Kathy. We have these data for 3 separate seasons for 3 separate years, and the types of the crops that were grown in each of these. We chose PlanetScope's 8-band product over these 3 years for a number of reasons. One is the spatial resolution issue. So Sentinel in this context was simply too coarse for us to think that it would reliably detect sweet potato, especially given that the plot sizes for sweet potato are quite small. So unlike some of the other crops we've been thinking about that are typically cereals that are over slightly larger ones, these are much, much smaller. We did this primarily on the computing cluster at William & Mary. You can think about alternatives. So this runs on cloud options. I think one of the interesting things to me about this project was that we effectively created a time series of the phenology within a season for each individual pixel that was within each plot. And what that means is that we use Planet's reasonably high frequency to collect bi-monthly, so twice a month, an observation of that field across all 8 of those bands, and feed that into an algorithm that attempts to use that to classify the crop type. Okay, so that algorithm is not seeing the specific time of the season, it's simply seeing that the first observation in the Meher season in 2021 for this particular pixel is this value on band 1 all the way through band 8, and then it's seeing that as a sequence effectively. So in some ways, this is kind of like a large language model that's thinking sequentially and predicting using the sequence rather than having any particular knowledge about sweet potato relative to the calendar time. We end up with basically 7 million sample pixel location. That's when you kind of fully spread that out, that's about 500 million unique pixel by time step by band values that we feed into this algorithm. This is the part where I'm going to really wave my hands. So where Jeff just mentioned, like this is work that when we started it 2 years ago was cutting edge. Now, even transformers are maybe like ish. But these are very similar in many ways, as I mentioned, the sequence relationship processing to what a lot of NLP and LLM models are doing. There's some, parallelization that the self-attention gets you. Interestingly, we attempted to do this first with 3 classes: sweet potato, potato, other crops. The model did not do very well at distinguishing 3 classes at one time. When we switched to 2 classes, sweet potato and other, we get model performance that approaches 74% in the Michler season and 67% in the Belg season. That's reasonably, that's decent performance. Like, again, this is a little bit of a which discipline you come from, how high do you want this to be, how overfitted you are, et cetera, right? So I'll let you be your own judges as to whether or not that's sufficient. And if you're a reviewer on this paper eventually, please be kind. What's interesting is that we get quite different, similar results on some dimensions and different ones on others from the ground data, the survey data that we mentioned before. This is for the overall pixel share that's predicted to be sweet potato. And this is whether or not the pixel is predicted to be fully sweet potato or not. And as you remember, Kathy referenced, we had a 17% impact from the ground data estimated for OFSP at this time for that 2023 season. We see a larger effect on any sweet potato at all when we do this. In this rightmost graph, that's about a 30% increase in whether a plot is planted with sweet potato at all. And also notably, we get noticeably higher precision out of the remote sense data than we do out of the ground data alone. And that's partly because we're combining these 2 sources. In fact, when we put kind of a horse race that I would consider to be a little bit more even, where we're trying to measure the same thing, that is this plot planted with sweet potato of any color or not? Here we have the green bars are the ones that are used, the remote sense data. The grayish blue bars, sorry for the color similarity, are the ones using the survey data alone. We get results that are similar across the 3 years, but noticeably higher precision when we use the remote sensing data. Again, that we're feeding it a lot more information and then training it on the ground data. So while we would not statistically say that these results are significant if we were to use the ground data alone, adding the remote sensing data allows us to distinguish similarly sized but more precise effects. So I think that's certainly like one key takeaway that we've had from this experience is even if you can only kind of get to 70-ish% performance, when you're actually using that then as a left-hand side or outcome measure, you don't necessarily need to get to 80 or 90% if it's correlated well enough with the treatment effects that are actually occurring on the ground. Again, that's still maybe a net improvement over using also noisy ground data alone. So a couple of key takeaways from this. The program impacts themselves were quite promising. Again, Kathy mentioned this was initially designed to be an emergency food program, delivering sweet potatoes and some training that was expected to last a year, maybe 2 years. The fact that 2+, in some cases 3 years on, these folks are actually still growing sweet potatoes is a really strong signal of the value of sweet potato to these households and also the ability to store that potato as seed and continue to grow it. So We've had a lot of bad news about programs that were thought to be promising today, but the remote sensing maybe was a downer. So this might be, trying to end on a more positive note for development in general. Again, 70-ish accuracy rates, achievable with, again, 3-meter resolution, reasonably high frequency data that's now available. That's actually, we thought, quite good, given that this was a hard problem. As you saw, there were not a ton of existing projects looking at, or papers looking at sweet potato classification in small plot context in sub-Saharan Africa. It's a hard problem on its own, reasonably doable now, especially since Planet's stack is now integrated into Google Earth Engine. You don't really need to run this on a dedicated cluster anymore. We did not continue to run the spillover analysis that we had initially intended, partially because that 70-ish% accuracy is probably good enough for direct outcome measurement on fields that are well delineated. But when we go to look at other nearby fields, we have no data on the field delineations and other kind of baseline characteristics. And as I think I've already complained to at least several people, there's not a great crop map that already captures kind of baseline like main classes in a place like Ethiopia in most of the world, despite recent advances by ESA and others. So it was very hard to have to believe that a 70% accuracy rate would get us reasonable adoption detection in the rest of the villages beyond the specific plots. I mentioned this before, but we really think, although we ran this stack on a dedicated computing cluster, it's now much, much more doable on cloud-based programs, especially for these kind of two-class models where you have a particular crop you care about and everything else is kind of in the background. Okay. Thanks again. Yeah, again, hard questions go to Kathy. Thanks.
Okay, let's have one more round of applause for all of our presenters today. We'll go ahead and move into the question and answer component. So if you have questions, can you just raise your hand so I can see where we might go? Okay, we'll start here in the front.
Thank you. Actually, I have a question for Ariel. I'm noticing the results of the accuracy of the different models, potatoes versus sweet potatoes and the others. I noticed that in a couple of instances, the pre-trained model was performing not as good as a model that you were just training from scratch. I'm very much interested in this finding, if you can elaborate why this is happening. Thank you.
That's a great question. No, I can't. We'll get you a better answer, but it was curious. We all noticed that, and you'll get a better answer from Seth Goodman, who's our actual computer scientist on this.
If I may chip in on that. So the reason why I ask is because we are dealing with the same issue with crop type mapping in general because of the lack of in situ data of adequate quality. So in theory, a pre-trained model should be able to predict in different epochs and different geographies where you're lacking the data. So when we are doing our internal tests, we're checking out, of course, what's available, and then we compare the results for areas where we do actually have the training data sufficient to train a model from scratch. And surprisingly, we get the same kind of results. Our explanation is that the pre-trained model may introduce a lot of noise, so it's a bit generic, and therefore it's not really able to support the promise, of not having to rely anymore on in situ data, actually. But it does a worse job of actually training a model from scratch. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, I will answer a bit. So I agree, and that's a great point that we went into this with actually a reasonable amount of ground data. So we had, these 3,000 plots. We thought the farmer recall about crop types might be a little bit dodgy for the first year, like a couple of years back, but sweet potatoes actually, for these farmers, are reasonably easy to recall. If you're asking about crop varieties that are maybe a little bit more similar, you might have worse performance that way. So, to your point, we didn't have to rely on a pre-trained model that was using data from other contexts or that was more generic. We just, basically went at this with the full survey data. If you were trying to optimize by using a smaller ground sample and trying to leverage pre-trained models, this might be, to your point, a little bit of a cautionary note.
Yeah. Thank you.
And then Richard.
Yeah, I think this is for Matt and perhaps Mitch as well. So, Matt, you said you had 11% adoption in your study area on sub 1. So it would really be interesting to me. So like in 2013, in Odisha, UP, Jharkhand, we did mapping. So we took 20 years of MODIS data and then just pixel by pixel, just made an assessment of the probability of flooding. So again, like Mitch said, you don't know the duration and the depth or anything, but these pixels are more prone to flood over time. And we did that because we wanted to direct the seed corporations where to disseminate SWARNA sub 1 and it would be, I don't know, could you kind of reverse engineer that to go back and take that 11% and compare it to the pixel probability for flooding to see if we were actually giving them good advice to, like, if especially when seed is limited. Maybe it's not so much limited now. In fact, every rice variety that comes out of Erie should have the sub 1 allele in it because it's pretty easy to insert. But would that be doable?
Yeah, I would have to think absolutely to do a reverse engineer would be pretty smart, and honestly, I might move beyond like the MODIS data that you all have, maybe what you were talking about, right? Like the CNN approach to kind of reverse engineer like back to get to a more fine resolution. Richard might be a good part of that kind of reverse engineering, but I would say like methodologically, it sounds like it'd be a sound, investigation, shall I say? Yeah. And this is probably not okay, but maybe it's okay. I just thought I would quickly respond to the gentleman in the front who asked the question on the pre-trained model versus, starting from scratch yourself. That was one of the components of our deck that I had to rush through a little bit, there is massive geographic bias involved in the current pre-trained models that are available. Global North being the huge sort of like input initial data set. So, I would love to see from these organizations that release the pre-trained models is actually show me a geographic distribution of where your data is coming from, right? It's largely, of course, coming from these US, EU-based farms and monocropping situations, right? And I think that it's a miss currently right now where people just kind of assume Google made this, IBM made this, they must have thought through all of these things. No, they thought through where could they get the most data the quickest and how could they compile it all and show clean outputs again for the common use of those models. And it's this unfortunate sort of like situation, right? Where of course, the majority of the people looking to use the models are in the global north, but then that's perpetuating this sort of situation where then you're only actually assessing, against this, this geographic bias, as opposed to taking a step back and saying, okay, where are we actually having a good heterogeneous data set that shows all of the different crop types, the soil types, et cetera. So just thought I'd comment.
Are there more questions? I know this is the last part before you get to leave, so. But any burning questions that we want to take now, or would you like to hold them for later? Okay. with that, we are going to close out our session for today. So thank you so much for joining us. I know it's a long day, a long first day. Many might be tired and jet lagged, so we appreciate all of your engagement throughout our sessions today. I do want to go over tomorrow a little bit. It is a little bit different than it is today. So today we met all together in this room. Tomorrow we will not be meeting together as a group, nor meeting in this room at all. So please refer to your agenda. You'll see that we are meeting in the Ethiopia and Philippines room. There were maps provided as well. It is on the second floor. We're going to have some signage to help direct people. It's kind of in a slightly different building. It's in this complex. You'll still come through the entrance you did this morning, but please be mindful